Okay, we are going to continue Unit 3, cellular respiration. Um, so this is the process of taking energy in food. So for instance, the plants, as they go through the process of photosynthesis, create glucose, and so that's their food. And then for other heterotrophs, we have to eat that glucose in whichever form, whether it's we eat the plants or the animals that eat the plants. So we convert that energy into a food, and we convert that energy into a chemical energy that our cells can use, right? So that's the process of cellular respiration. So how does energy and food power organisms? And so all organisms go through this process, not just animals, not just heterotrophs, but autotrophs go through this as well, right? Because they even though they don't need to eat their food, they still need to get that glucose molecule to convert it into energy for the cells. All right, so we talked about energy not being able to be created or destroyed. So be careful when we ask you about matter, don't put in energy. But the difference between matter and energy is that if you remember, energy cannot be recycled. Once we use it, it goes into um, a useful to a less useful form, right? We release it as heat and we can't ever recycle it. Matter, on the other hand, gets recycled over and over and over again, right? Since matter can't be um, created or destroyed. And we are talking about in the context of Earth. So the cycling of elements makes life possible on Earth. So that's, for me, that's pretty fascinating, is that the molecules that make you up have been around for billions of years. These aren't new molecules. They've been used over and over and over again, right? So, the molecules that make up you initially were from your mom, and that was from what she ate, right? And the ones that make you grow and develop are from the things that you eat, right? And those things are from the soil and the plants and the animals and things that have been around, and those molecules have been around over and over again. And we're not just talking about, let's say, carbon. We're going to be talking about water, oxygen, nitrogen. All these elements that make up the earth get recycled, at least the ones that get through, go through the living organisms. So matter can undergo physical or chemical change, right? So you may have talked about that in some type of physical science class before, right? So the physical changes of molecules don't change the structure, right? So we're talking from water that goes from ice to, which is a solid, to water, which is a liquid. So that it doesn't change. It's still H2O. It's just, either a solid or a liquid. Chemical changes of molecules will break and rebuild bonds between atoms, although all those same atoms are still present. So if you remember back, I think most of you have done some type of balancing of equations. That's the conservation of matter. You have to make sure that the same number of molecules, let's say hydrogen atoms, we have 4 on this side, have to equal 4 on this side. And the same with oxygen. We have to have 2 on this side and then 2 on this side, right? So that's the conservation of matter. All right, so that's what we talk about, conservation of matter. So what is cellular respiration? It's a process, it's a chemical reaction, it's a process that happens within our cells that convert glucose and oxygen into a chemical energy, and that energy is ATP, and we'll talk about what ATP is, and in the mitochondria. Now, granted, like bacteria don't have mitochondria, but all multicellular organisms like plants and animals and other things do have a mitochondria, right? So we'll differentiate that later, but just know that only the higher order organisms or multicellular organisms have that organelle. So all living organisms need energy, and all living things need to perform cellular respiration. So, that's sort of a question we ask in a test, is that, do just animals need to produce energy or go through the process of cellular respiration, or is it just heterotrophs, or is it autotrophs, or is it everything, right? So all organisms go through cellular respiration. So here is our equation for cellular respiration. It may look familiar in a sense that it is opposite of what photosynthesis is, right? So if I know way back when, we talk about photosynthesis as the plants taking in carbon dioxide and water and converting that into oxygen and then a sugar, glucose. Well, this is the opposite process. So we take that glucose molecule and oxygen and convert that into carbon dioxide, which we breathe out along with water, a little bit of water, but we create this most important thing right here, and that's energy in the form of what we call ATP. So ATP is the usable energy in a cell, right? Energy is stored within the bond of the ATP molecule. And you can see here, it's actually stored between the second and third phosphate of this ATP. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So tri means 3. And then when that molecule is broken off and energy is released, it turns into what we call adenosine diphosphate. All right. So we talked about how energy is stored within the chemical bonds of molecules. Well, this is a really powerful break. Right? A lot of energy in this. So energy is released when the last bond in ATP is broken and ADP is formed. Right? So ATP to ADP, we lose that phosphate. The goal of cellular respiration is to produce ATP, usable energy within the cells, right? Because that's what the cells need from glucose. So we store energy as glucose, and we talked a little bit about that in our nutrient notes, is that carbohydrates are relatively high energy and easily accessible. And this is why we can easily break down this glucose molecule into ATP. All right, so how does it work? All right, so whoops, I think I missed oh yeah, okay, so how does it work? So there are 2 stages, all right? So glycolysis is the first stage, and this is important because it happens in the cytoplasm. And this is important because all organisms have cytoplasm, even bacteria. Right? So when we talk about glycolysis, this happens in all organisms. And it takes that glucose molecule and it converts it into 2 ATP, this molecule called pyruvate, and then high energy electrons. And so these high energy electrons are, you can see right here, these electrons go across the membrane in the mitochondria. But for the bacteria, this is all the energy they create, right? So if you think about bacteria, they don't need a lot of energy. They just, sort of float around looking for some type of nutrition. They make proteins, but for the most part, they're not multicellular. They don't they don't have muscles. They don't really have a digestive system. So they don't need that much energy. So they only create 2 ATP. And that's, because they do have a cytoplasm. So, they do go through this process of glycolysis, and that's where it stops for bacteria. But however, if you're a multicellular organism like us, as I mentioned before, we have mitochondria, right? So that pyruvate molecule will go over through the membrane of the mitochondria and convert that oxygen pyruvate. Remember, we had a pyruvate molecule. This acetyl-CoA is sort of it's a byproduct of pyruvate. It turns into acetyl-CoA once it starts the process, but you don't need to know that. And high energy electrons, and then that would be this NADH is just an electron carrier and goes into the mitochondria and produces 34 ATP. Right, so we have 32 here, we have 2 here, 32 plus 2, and then we had the 2 from before. So we're talking about 36 total ATP per 1 molecule of glucose. And that's really important to remember. So for 1 molecule of glucose, we can produce 36 ATP, right? And we also produce carbon dioxide and water, which we get rid of as waste, right? So carbon dioxide we breathe out. Water, we do a lot of things with water. There is water in our breath, and we do save that water, right? So that's important to know that with 1 molecule of glucose, this is our molecule of glucose, we produce 36 ATP, all right? And so here is our equation, right? So we have 1 molecule of glucose. We have 6 molecules of oxygen, and that yields, remember that arrow means in chemistry, 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, and then 36 ATP. Now, you can see that we have a conservation of matter. If you count all of these up, we're going to have 6 carbons, we're going to have 12 hydrogens, and we're going to have 18 oxygens, right? So there's 6 and 12, and 6 plus 12, right? Because 6 times 2 is 12. So we have 18 oxygens. So if you go back over here, we're going to have 6 oxygens, 12 hydrogens, right? Because we have 12 hydrogens over here. And if we add up the oxygens, we're going to have 6 times 2 is 12, plus another 6 is 18. So we have this conservation of energy. All right, now you see, okay, well, how about this ATP? Well, this ATP really isn't part of the equation in a sense that it is added to the equation, to the process as it moves along, right? The energy is, right, we're going to talk about the conservation of energy because we have to have that same amount of energy, and that energy is within the bonds of this molecule. All right, so again, and this is, so first it represents a conservation of matter because it demonstrates, because the same number of atoms are in the reactants that are in the product. And if I go back, remember that these are the reactants and these are the products of a chemical equation. What goes in is the reactants, what comes out is the products, right? And then the energy, because the same amount of energy enters and exits the process. Some of that energy leaves as ATP and some leaves as heat, right? So that energy within the glucose molecule is converted into the energy within that ATP molecule to make that ATP molecule, and then some that leaves as heat. All right. So here's the overview of cellular respiration. All right, so here's our glucose molecule in our cytoplasm, right? Remember that, highlight, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, and you can write 2 ATP here, right? So glucose, through the process of glycolysis, converts into pyruvic acid, it says, but you can change that to pyruvate, all right? Pyruvate, and then also we have that high electrons, and those electrons are used to drive the equation. To drive this process. It's very complicated, and if you take AP Bio, or if you get into college, you'll learn all about it. But just this whole process needs energy, and one of the ways that it gets energy is through these high energy electrons that are transferred over there. But that you don't really need to know that. Right, what you do need to know is that pyruvate goes into here, and the pyruvate is really, all it really is 2 3-carbon molecules. So the glucose gets split in half, and then it will get released as carbon dioxide. All right, so we have 2 ATP here, and then this is where cellular respiration. I know that we call this cellular respiration, but the whole process. So you put 2 ATP here, 2 ATP here, and 32 ATP here, so equals 36 ATP. All right. And I don't know if this is a link to something. I don't think so. Oh yeah, so we have our amoeba sisters, I think.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct.
Okay, so yeah, we'll play this in, if you have a chance to play this, you can play this. This is sort of a funny little song, and because I would play it, but I'm not sure if it will go over. All right, so that's it for cellular respiration. We'll go over it a little bit more, explain a little bit more in class. So we'll see you next week.